Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's Security Boulevard webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. We have a great webinar on tap today, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to access it later on. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for our speaker, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your question, and we will try to get to as many as we can near the end of today's webinar. Also, we have 3 polling questions during today's webinar, so please be engaged and give your answers as you see fit. And then also at the end of today's webinar, we are going to be doing a drawing for 6 $25 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of our 6 lucky winners. All right, with that, let's go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is Protect 2020, Securing the Heart of Our Election Systems. Our speaker today is Steve Kamey, who is the, let's see if I get this right, the Industry Solutions Specialist, U.S. Public Sector Cybersecurity at Cisco. How are you, Steve?
I'm doing quite well, Charlene. How are you?
Great, great. I'm doing great. And I'm so excited about this topic, and I know you have a lot to talk about, so I'm going to put myself on mute, take myself off camera, and let you get right into your presentation.
All right, that sounds fantastic, and that's a crazy sounding title for just the fact that I focus on cybersecurity, for public sector here at Cisco. And I hope you guys find out that this is an incredibly, good use of your time today. This hashtag is, I'll describe it in a second, but obviously as we get closer to the general election, things are going to get, incredibly important. And that the abstract that we pointed out right before we get to the polling question, as you signed up for the registration page, it really is a pivotal moment, right? There's a lot of things going on. I don't think anyone expected, 2020 to look like it does. But one thing that's kind of similar between 2016 election and 2020 is that we need to focus on cybersecurity, right? There's no perfect cybersecurity sets of controls that'll work for every single election system, but I think we all feel like we can do better, right, than we did in 2016. And so one of the things that I'm going to focus on today as we go through it, as the title implies, is the voter registration process, right? The actual systems that make up the voter registration systems, and in particular, the voter registration database is really the heart of these systems. And we're going to focus on the cybersecurity controls that are most, effective there. Right, so as we go through this, we're going to, cover the nature of election systems, obviously why we're focusing on voter registration systems and what to do about it. Right, so with that, why don't we get to the first polling question?
Okay, you see the polling question there on your screen. That first polling question is, your time is valuable. Why did you join our webinar today? You can select from, I am responsible for election security in my role, or I am not responsible for election security, but interested in the topic, I imagine.
Yeah, I think we're just trying to have a better understanding of who actually needs to take specific action, or if we're just trying to generally get a better understanding of what the, what those recommendations are.
Excellent, excellent. Well, while we're waiting for everybody to submit their response, I do want to just very quickly remind the audience that at any time during today's presentation, if you have a question for Steve, you can just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions. You don't have to wait until we get to the question and answer period. Okay, Steve, I'm going to go ahead and close out this poll, and we'll take a look at the results. I have a feeling we're all going to be maybe not so surprised, but we'll see. Here we go. Here are the results. 85% said they're not responsible for election security, but they're interested.
So we kind of expected that, right?
Yeah.
Part of the reason why is, obviously in state and local governments where we handle, election security, they're incredibly small teams, right? So there's not actually a lot of people, that are out there. But I think all of us are interested in making sure that these elections are, as secure as possible, right? So why don't we go through it and we'll move forward here a little bit. Am I sharing my slides again, Charlene? I can't quite tell.
Yes, you are. You're all good.
All right. All right, so let's move past the poll question. 5 things we're going to cover today. I have a bunch of slides, but we're not going to spend a lot of time on any particular slides. The first thing I'm going to focus on are the absolute most important things, and I'll give you a hint. It is not technology. So we'll spend a few seconds, on that. Then we'll talk about the actual election system themselves. right? Especially for those of you who may not understand how these election systems are put together and some of the components. We'll describe it very briefly. And then I think you'll probably see as we go through that is that what actually makes securing these systems so incredibly difficult, right? So we'll take a look at some of those particular challenges. Now, the MITRE organization, Charlene, from Northern Virginia, MITRE does a lot of, public-private partnerships, a lot of thought leadership on a lot of topics. They've put together some really important controls to secure these voter registration systems that are probably, I'm going to guess, a significant percentage of us haven't heard about and why they're important. And then, of course, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about what to do about those recommendations. So that's the 5 main components of our agenda. So let's start with the most important things. And this has nothing to do with elections, or does it? So I think back to like 1933, right? Not because we're trying to compare this time to the Great Depression era, but for those of you who remember our history, Franklin Delano Roosevelt took the US off the gold standard. So the question I have for you is, what actually backs the US dollar, right? Back in the day, right, the US dollar was backed by a certain amount of gold, right? You could have a piece of paper that was a US dollar or a coin, right? And you knew that it was backed by something. So what is it that backs a dollar today? And you might think, well, nothing, right? If there's no gold standard or there's no, dollar value associated with a particular set of gold, but there really is something that's incredibly important and it relates to election security, and that is the faith and trust in the currency, right? We've seen a lot of countries where that faith gets lost, right? And you see spiraling inflation and those kinds of things. And just like elections, we have to put our faith in this currency. Otherwise, things basically grind to a halt. So the most important things, and this is incredibly important as we go through this, right? And not just from a technology perspective, but when it comes to these elections, we have to have faith and confidence and trust in the entire process, right? Not just the technology, but we have to believe in the election results. And obviously there's a lot of things that can undermine, our belief in the election results, right? So when the actual tally is finally done, it may not be done on election night this year because of all the the challenges that we're facing. We have to all come together as a country and agree that this is the actual results that we believe in. So the things that can undermine results, right? These are just a few things and are not necessarily mutually exclusive. 2016, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the foreign interference and related to that, or some of their information operations. I'm going to highlight a little bit, from CISA, what they described about some of the information operations. And then obviously, there's things like voter fraud, either legitimate or just the thought or accusations of things like, voter fraud. And that relates to things like, allegations like that we can, claim, or things that happen out there on social media, all kinds of allegations or conspiracy theories. And then perhaps, most relevant for this conversation today is cybersecurity, right? So if there's an actual cybersecurity breach that affects our, voter registration systems, the American population may not believe in its results, right? And we've seen, like I said, we saw some of that in 2016. So we'll cover some of this stuff as we go forward, but again, we're going to try to focus in this webinar on the things that we can kind of control, which brings us to #Protect2020. I use that in my webinar title, but I didn't make it up, right? It came from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. It's part of the DHS, also called CISA, right? And they're the lead federal agency now for election security. One thing that's different about this election, like right after the 2016 election, is that we've finally classified election systems as critical infrastructure, just like power systems and healthcare and stuff like that, things that are considered critical infrastructure. And there's different security that gets addressed around critical infrastructure. So CISA is that lead federal agency. And they've put together this hashtag that's like a national call to action to help bolster election security, right? And they've put together a lot of resources and different kind of outreach things for, for state and local governments, which you may know that they're the ones that are responsible, for the election systems themselves. We'll talk about, somehow that, stuff kind of comes together. And as an example of one of those resources, right? And this isn't like, it's tied specifically to voter registration systems. I thought I'd show like one of their assets that they put together about, understanding foreign interference, right? Going from like, anywhere out there in cyberspace to actually affecting the real world. So what they've done is they've created this fictitious thing called the war on pineapple, right? So the question is, does pineapple belong on pizza, right? That's a silly topic to relate to, to election security, but it's something that could potentially be polarizing. I, for one, I'm not the biggest fan of pineapple
And
on
I
pizza?
and I
Charlene, you
love
were going to say?
pineapple on pizza. Yes,
Right. So it's
so
very
yeah, you and I
polarizing,
would
right?
have something to talk about for
So
sure.
clearly you're wrong that
Wait a minute.
we're already got a divisive issue going. So here are the 5 steps, right, that they tended to go through. They'll start with a divisive issue, like we just described, Charlie, like the argument over whether pizza is like, it should belong on pizza or not. And the point here is about dividing Americans, right? And well, we're on ourselves, right? And this is the kind of things that our foreign adversaries love to see, is the nation divided, right? So you start with a divisive issue. Then you start mobilizing social media. So you put these different accounts in place. They pointed out that, like, a lot of times you'll start with a social media account. You'll build time to get followers and things. And a lot of times they'll rename it to something, right? Because it takes a long time to get a social media account with thousands or millions of followers. So why not use one that you've used before, change its name to be like Pizza Pro now, right? And now we're going to use Pizza Pro to start mobilizing our, disinformation campaign. Right, so now you start saying like, look, being pizza on, pineapple on pizza is un-American, which, by the way, Charlene, it is. No, I'm kidding. Sorry, can't resist.
Hey,
Or
don't get me
millennials are ruining pizza, right? It's
started.
not, it's not the baby boomers that are ruining pizza. It's the millennials. You get the idea, right? So they use that kind of thing to start dividing, doing a lot of ridiculous type chatter. And then sometimes, this stuff ends up getting picked up by the national news, like legitimate mainstream media. So they start covering that, which further gets more attention on this, this topic, right? And ultimately, you start motivating people in the real world to start, around this divisive issue. So again, this is just one example of several that just CISA puts together to kind of educate people on, just how elections can be affected, right? This is a foreign, potentially foreign interference leading to a misinformation campaign. So like we said, there's a lot of things that can undermine, cybersecurity. So this webinar obviously isn't really focused on that stuff. I just thought that was a fun, topic, especially now that I can argue with Charlene during this presentation about it. But let's focus on what we can, right? The cybersecurity aspects of it, and let's absolutely do everything we possibly can to prevent anything from cybersecurity, from a cybersecurity perspective, from affecting our results, right? That's the last thing on top of all this other stuff that we need to do. And another thing that we ought to do is, as we're making progress, Cisco Talos is our research organization. I'll mention them a few more times. They have been studying this issue intently for the past like 4 years. And some of the quotes that they put out there is like, let's make sure that people know, like the American voters know about the progress that we're making, right? So some of the quotes that they put out there, and again, I'll highlight some of their, their content later, is they say like, look, we should be open about the investments that we're making, right? We should highlight and market, right, the progress that we're doing, so that, we actually believe in this stuff, right? We should let people know that we are paying attention, to cybersecurity. And then let's also start with the things that we can actually do today, which brings me to the main point of our presentation here today. It is a publication that MITRE put together that I came across. It was published in late, last year. They put together what's called recommended security controls for voter registration. And when I took a look at this, I was like, this is really fantastic, because it highlights the need to focus on voter registration, right? It's been, put together by a well-respected organization. Like I said, they do public-private partnerships, right? They're focused on, generally making a safer world, right? And there's some really great advice, right? For someone like me who loves things like cybersecurity best practices, it kind of resonated with me as something that we can actually take action with now. Even if there's only just a couple of months between now and the general election, these things are things that we can do right now. So let's go to the second poll question, right? I heard you probably heard me mention things like cybersecurity best practices, and I'm just kind of curious out there, like what best practices do you follow, right? I just listed a few of them here. What guides your investment decisions? So Charlene, why don't we open that up to
Yeah,
everyone?
so it's should be right there on your screen now. The polling question is, which cybersecurity best practice do you use the most? You can choose from the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, CIS Controls, ISO 27000-2700 series, or 27,000, I should say, MITRE ATT&CK, or none of the above. So why don't you go ahead and make your choice, your selection. And again, just want to remind the folks, if you have a question, please don't wait. You can use your GoToWebinar control panel at any time during the webinar, and we'll collect those questions and then look at them during the question and answer period near the end of today's webinar.
And it might be
All
none of
right.
the above, right? There are others certainly out there like COBIT 5, right? There's also the NIST 800-53, which is the gold standard in the federal government. I'm just kind of curious, right, as we go through, what people
Yeah.
say.
Yeah, okay, well, I'll give you guys about 5 more seconds and then we'll close it out because I want to keep the webinar moving along here.
Yep.
So I'm going to go ahead and close it now. We'll take a look at the results. Looks like the majority of folks are using the NIST cybersecurity framework, which actually doesn't really surprise me because that's the one I hear about the most.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense to do too, right? Because the actual title of that, we shortened it to the NIST cybersecurity framework, but it's actually the framework for improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity, right? It's and obviously we just talked about how election systems are focused on, on critical infrastructure. And the other thing I'll mention too is that, as the paper that I mentioned with the, the recommended controls, right? They've actually mapped everything back to the cybersecurity framework in an appendix. So it's a good thing, right? It kind of ties in. It kind of ties in there.
Awesome.
All
I'll
right.
hide the results and let you get back to it.
All right, so let's take a look at the election system and some of the pieces, right? I'm not going to belabor this, and in part, because there's a lot of different technology components. But if we actually look through the different types of technologies that need to come together from an election perspective, you need some kind of system to manage the entire system. They call it an EMS, or an election, management system. I also highlighted, the voter registration database. This sort of dates back to the early 2000s when they it was called HAVA, like the Help America Vote Act, provided funding, and it almost gave like a statewide mandate to maintain, voter registration information in electronic systems, right? So the VRDB is, pretty consistent. I don't exactly know why North Dakota doesn't have one. I ought to find that out, but, in 49 states, we have, voter registration databases that are kind of the heart, of the system. And then obviously there's all kinds of other different components that need to interact with this. We have to do things like election night reporting. We have the electronic poll books that actually, happen inside the actual, the voting, the poll places. We have the machines themselves that people use. We have ballot counting machines, which might grow in importance, especially if we do things like, more mail-in voting and optical scanners and things like that. And when you think about all the technology pieces and how they have to sort of come together and geographically dispersed, right? We have to get results, in and out of the system. When you really think about, election systems in general, it's a big, spider web of different things, right? And like I mentioned, the voter registration database, it holds a lot of incredibly important information on voters. Here's a sample like for Texas of just like, what you see on a voter registration card. Yeah, it might be printed on a card, but it came out of a database, right? So they have your name, they have your address, your social security number, right? All this other information, your year of birth, right? All this incredibly important, information that, obviously is held by the voter registration systems. So we have to think about how voter registration systems are so important. It's like I mentioned, it's kind of the heart of the overall election system. And I highlight this partly because, there was the Senate, report that was put together on the Russian activity that interfered with the 2016 election. And this is, it's just literally I kind of pulled out from the report, and some of it was redacted, probably for, cybersecurity and, security clearance information. But as you can see here, they said, mid-20 July, Illinois discovered like malicious network activity, right, that led to a large increase in information that left the state election network, right? The next thing is that, the data exfiltration that affected the voter registration database. So like they highlighted the importance of like, look, these are under attack. I mean, they were under attack. There's no reason to think that these attacks will abate, as we move forward and through 2020, right? So we ought to really try to pay attention, right? If there's a starting point to do, the voter registration systems are definitely a key place, right? And it's not just about stealing that data. Even if you have make attempts, right? Imagine if a large scale, cyber attack was launched and we started publishing information about multiple states that, have had voter registration deleted or manipulated, or, dates of birth changed, or political party affiliation, right? All that stuff speaks to like undermining the overall confidence, right? It ties back to that thing that's so important for us in an American democracy. We have to believe in this stuff, right? We have to trust in these election systems, and anything that affects the perceptions. I hate to say perception is reality, but in a lot of cases it is, right? How we perceive election legitimacy and trust in the results, these kind of things then lead to fueling conspiracy theories and all kinds of other stuff, right? So again, I just point this out to highlight the reason why when you take a look at an incredibly complex, diverse system like an election system in different states, focusing on some of the heart and the key parts of it, might be a great place to start. Now, MITRE has put together what they call like a general voter registration system architecture. And again, this is in that publication. We're going to share with you this presentation and the links that that are all here. This is, their work. And what they've done is they just put together a generalized rendition of what a voter registration, system looks like. And at the very heart of that, you see a SQL, database that actually holds that information. And then there's like an application server that's typically like a front end for the election officials. On the left-hand side, they'll use their workstations or other devices to go and enter information or get information out, right? You see at the bottom, the state, network. So these election systems have to integrate with the Department of Motor Vehicles, right? Because we want to verify, voter registration against DMV or Bureau of Vital Statistics within the state or other state government. And on the right, it even integrates with external, things like third parties. There's things like the Social Security Administration that it integrates with. Ultimately we have, voters that are, registering and stuff like that. So it's, again, it kind of illustrates the point of being complex, and you can't just like put a firewall, to block all this stuff. But there's a lot of legitimate traffic that needs to flow in and out, right? So it's just interesting, like they, put this picture together to kind of give us a sense, of what these election systems, are kind of all about. Which kind of, to me, brings me to the topic of what makes securing it so hard. Right, so some of the things that we've already described are, for example, each state, runs its own election system. The fact that these things integrate with a lot of different components, right? So let's take a look at some of that stuff. Now, when Talos, or Cisco Talos, like our threat research organization, was doing this research, I don't know who to credit. I don't think they do either, but they've heard this multiple times. Is that if you've seen one election system, you've seen one election system, right? And that just kind of goes to the point that because this is done individually in each different state, there's a lot of inconsistency. And it's also why MITRE put that generalized rendition together, because it's not like there's one architecture that's used across the entire United States. So because each state runs their own election system, the first thing you'll think about is, inconsistency there. Secondly, the design and architecture will naturally vary from state to state, right? It's not like you take something from the federal government and go implement it, right? We talked about how there's a lot of integrations that happen both within the state's network, like the state DMV, for example, or motor vehicle authority, but then integrations that go outbound to like election night reporting, to Social Security Administration, for example, right? So there's a lot of integrations that happen there. The fact that the election officials themselves, the workstations that they use to go and update things like voter registration information, it's also the same workstations they're doing for everything else. Right? It's not like they have dedicated workstations for these kinds of things. So they might be doing their web browsing, their email and stuff like that from this same exact system, right? We all know that, especially today, a lot of state budgets are under a lot of pressure. They have been for a long time. The pandemic certainly isn't helping. States like Texas, for example, that rely on sales tax revenue are seeing a massive impact, right? So that you can't afford and to go and have dedicated systems for, like election systems, for example. And it's an important point, as we move forward. And like I mentioned too, there's also no nationwide security standards. So a lot of you acknowledge the NIST cybersecurity framework that guide, your investment decisions. And there's certainly a lot of states that look to the federal government and the National Institute of Standards and Technology, but it's not like there's any kind of mandate or compliance requirement. It's not like, the payment card industry for, collecting, payment card information. It's not like it's a data security standard you have to comply and an auditor comes around. That doesn't happen here. Right? There's a lot of general guidance that's put out there, but there's no standard, there's no auditing process, right? There's no consistency there. And then like we mentioned before, the limited resources, not just in terms of manpower, right? Only 15% of you maybe of this whole webinar, I think it's very small teams that are responsible for this, election security. And the budget aspect of it, can't be overlooked. So Matt Olney is the Director of Threat Intelligence at Cisco Talos, and I'll mention him a couple more times because he actually put together this fantastic white paper recently. He's just about to publish it, and he's going to talk at Black Hat in a little bit here. But he put out there like a quote that I thought was actually pretty important, Right? Election security can't be solved by just looking at the individual components of the system. That is absolutely something that everybody would agree to, right? You have to take a holistic approach. You have to take an architectural approach, right? But at the same time, you have to have a place to start, right? So that kind of statement might contrast a little bit with what we've been describing up to this point, only because a lot of times we have to take a big problem and break it down into its pieces and focus on the things that are important first. So everybody would agree that we ought to be looking at the entire, components of the entire system, and many states already have. But when it comes to like I said, taking action, for me, any kind of problem needs to be broken down into its components, prioritized and addressed first. And I think that is the rationale, for why MITRE in particular focused on the voter registration systems, and I'll talk to you about their recommendations here in this next section. So I've mentioned this a couple of times, right? There are recommended security controls. Again, the presentation we'll share with you. You can see in the bottom left-hand corner is a direct link to the to the PDF download. But they put this quote out there, right? As evidenced by the widespread attacks, voter registration databases are of particular interest to sophisticated adversaries. And again, the point here is like, we really ought to focus there. There's a lot of things that we can focus on, but let's make sure our house is in order when it comes to the voter registration systems, and let's pay attention, to these controls. And you'll see as we go through this, there's enough to do there alone, right, without looking at the entire architecture. So here are some of the summary of their controls, right? If you only read up to like the second page, of their document, these 5 things will jump out at you. The first one is about securing those external connections, right? Because we talked about how the voter registration systems integrate with both things that are on the state network, but also outside the state network, and even with third-party, types of systems, right? So they talk about, and there's subcomponents to these too, right? And then once we secure those connections, we have to strengthen the defenses, right, both internally and externally. So you saw that system architecture that described firewalls, but there's a lot more to it, than that. The third thing is about enhancing the overall access management. Access is so critical, right? You've heard that things like identity is the new perimeter now, right? We have to trust in not only the people and their devices and what's actually accessing these systems, and how do we prove, how do we authenticate, how do we authorize systems, right? And then as you move forward, right, improve the overall system management and monitoring, and then facilitating recovery. So let's break these things down, because this is really the heart of what the publication is all about. Let's take a look at each one. The first thing is the secure external connections. So there's 4 main subcomponents that they put out here. And on the left-hand side is sort of a quote of how they summarize it, right? How to go and evaluate and protect these communications with external systems. And again, it's remembering that these voter registration systems integrate with a lot of different systems. So we can't block them, right? We have to allow these things to flow. But at the same time, we ought to make sure that we pay attention to securing those things. So the first thing, before you do anything, right, you'll see patterns of communication as one of those subcomponents. That means you really have to have a solid understanding of what traffic is legitimate and what isn't, right? So you have to take a look at that network traffic, right? You have to analyze it. You have to make sure that it fits with things like, baseline of normal network, connections, right? So that before you put any kind of controls in place, you have to know what's legitimate and what isn't. And that alone is actually pretty difficult, right? For any of those of you who've done any kind of network, analysis or pulled in, NetFlow type records, it's pretty challenging. And then once you understand those patterns, then you can do a better job of doing things like protecting, those connections. One of the key aspects that they highlight in the protecting of connections is about encryption, right? And that's, a lot of people understand the importance of encryption, but they also highlight the importance of making sure those encryption, crypto modules are up to date, right? It's almost worse if you use an out of date, crypto module, something that can easily, be broken. And the other thing they also pointed out is to, watch for things that are actually going in the clear. Like if there's applications that are not encrypted, turn that stuff off, right? We have to make sure that all the information that's traveling in transit is kept, secure. We also talked about in that architecture, there's a lot of different endpoints that are part of the overall system, right? We have the, things like the election system workstations that we described. We talked about the web application front end to the voter registration database. We have to make sure that those things are who they say they are, right? Not just the people, but also the devices themselves. It comes back to that whole, kind of zero trust or device trust, type of concept, right? So there's a lot of different ways to focus on authentication through things like digital certificates and other things. But obviously, clearly making sure that those endpoints are who they say they are, and the fact that they're authorized, right, ties into an incredibly important aspect here. And then verifying the data once it gets to the place where it needs to go. And they describe aspects like, digital signatures, right? When a legitimate party has received that information and stored it, let's sign the fact that that data has actually gotten there and it's gotten there securely. So that's one of 5, right? Securing the external connections. The next set of things is about strengthening those external and internal, network defenses, right? So now there's 5 more controls that are underneath this. One of them is about network segmentation and isolation. Do you remember from the architecture diagram where there are a couple of firewalls put in place? Segmentation isn't just about plopping a firewall up any longer, right? Yes, firewalls are incredibly important, but it's also about making sure that the network itself can enforce where that traffic can go, right? We have to get more granular. There's terms like micro segmentation, for example, or segmenting within applications. This one focuses, particularly on network segmentation to make sure that the network itself is split up and managed in a way that, only authorized systems from one segment can talk to another, for example. Then of course it gets into firewalls that focus on things like the importance of application, layer type inspection, that type of visibility and control. That's been firewalls have been around since the the mid 90s, maybe, or even earlier than that. Some of the earliest application firewalls that I can remember were from like the early 2000s. But clearly, there's still obviously a need for firewalls, right? But the importance here is to focus on the modernization of it. The third thing might jump out at you. You might see like intrusion detection systems, and a lot of times, that whole IDS, mentality has moved to intrusion prevention, types of systems. IDS evolved into IPS years ago. One of the reasons why they pointed out the focus on intrusion detection, and I think less emphasis on prevention, is first of all, if you're a critical infrastructure operator, right? If you're responsible for like the operation of a power plant, for example, you have to be really careful about things taking automatic action that can break things, right? So a lot of times in critical infrastructure, and again, election systems are considered critical infrastructure these days, the idea of getting better detection and having that flow through a process, right? So that, human beings can inspect things before they occur, right? That's actually one aspect of, I think, one of the reasons why they pointed out the emphasis on intrusion detection. Yes, we need it, but we ought to be a little bit careful about doing things like prevention, because things like false positives they'll never go away, or false negatives, right? Then they get into things like device access control, and then they also talk about things like the email, web, and content filtering. The last one being remembering that the election officials who are interacting with these systems are actually using their normal workstation. So they're doing email, they're doing web browsing. Of course, if you compromise that device, that might provide a vector to get into the voter registration systems and provide the attackers a way in, right? So that's one of the reasons why they pointed out, these 5 things. What you're starting to see, though, is that we've only gotten to item number 2, and we already have a list of 9 things, right? And it continues forward into things like enhancing access management. They point out the importance of role-based access, or a similar concept is least privilege. Like, make sure we give people and systems the absolute least amount of rights or privileges to be able to do the job that they need without giving them too many, right? Too much access can obviously, lead to a lot of potential problems, right? If you have someone has just too much access, I'll give you an example from my own past. I worked for a financial organization in the early or mid 90s, and I had root access to our public web server, right? So back in the mid 90s, it was just, wasn't like online banking was available yet. But as someone right out of school with root access, I almost deleted a whole set of content just because I typed the wrong Unix command, right? RM dash, right? So that kind of stuff is, we can't have that stuff today, and that those types of principles are incredibly important to keep in mind. Second, and this is also on the list of items, is multi-factor authentication. We all know the problems related with passwords, shared passwords, writing passwords down, writing strong passwords, trying to, change passwords every 30 days, trying to change passwords to systems that multiple people access, right? Passwords are terrible. We all know that that's an issue, but we also have to be able to provide something else other than something that you know, ideally something that you have, whether it's a certificate or a phone or something like that, to ensure that you are who you say you are. And this has come a long way. We'll talk a little about this, as we move forward here. Third, they pointed out the importance of, centralizing or federated identity management. And the reason why they point that out is like, not only is it, people within the state network, for example, or it's not like there's just one domain of identities that need to access this stuff. There's third parties that need the identities that are out there interacting with the system too. So, they talk about the importance of, federating that identity management using standards like the security assertion markup language, right, to be able to drive better, federated identity management across these different domains of responsibility, and just doing a better job of, controlling that, the identities. And then also the supply chain risk, when you think about all the different components and vendors and people as you go all the way through the entire supply chain and where you're purchasing from, right? The focus on supply chain risk is also, extremely important there. And then in the last two, right, I'll try to breeze through these a little bit faster without going through too much detail. I'm just providing a little bit of highlight of what, again, these are the MITRE's 5, top recommendations, which, splits into additional things. Now they talk about improving the system management and monitoring, right? So collecting logs from the systems, right? Aggregating these logs and actually analyzing them. Every time someone logs into the system or the database writes the transaction, every time somebody makes a configuration change or updates the firewall rules, we have to keep track of all those different events, right? It's the birthplace of the security information and event management market, where I myself have spent a good, portion of my own career. So we have to do a better job of being able to pull and analyze all that information, and it's clear, right? Understanding what's actually happening on the network and in those systems is incredibly important. And then obviously continuing to scan for vulnerabilities, right? No software is ever going to be perfect. We all know that. There's always going to be vulnerabilities. There's going to be out-of-date systems, right? So we have to constantly scan applications, operating systems, devices, to make sure that there aren't systems that are introducing too much risk onto the election networks. The third one is actually jumps out at me as being like so incredibly important is asset management, right? And even for those of you who follow the NIST cybersecurity framework, the identity function, they put out there the importance of hardware inventory management, software inventory management. It aligns with the CIS controls. I mean, you can't protect things unless you know what you have, right? And managing those assets on an election network is, obviously it's paramount importance to know what you have on your network, right? And related to vulnerability scanning is patching, right? Once we already know that there's a patch, let's get those patches out, tested, right, and rolled out, in a timely basis. Then they talk about doing things like, auditing things like, local database auditing, right? So instead of trying to do a lot of that manually, why don't you look for, potential transactions that are sort of high risk to be able to go in there and do that type of, database auditing. And then finally, they talk about protecting those endpoints that have privileges. Especially I think about the, the election officials workstations, right? Anybody who has access to go and enter information or get information into a voter registration system from that endpoint, we ought to make sure that that endpoint is protected from potential threats. And we've done a lot of things already. We put, firewalls around it. We've done access management around it, but a lot of times things can get through, right? So it works, who knows where that workstation, what network it connected to. So let's make sure that those privileged endpoints, we're doing proper, protection of those systems in case anything actually reaches the end device. And then finally, they point out the importance of facilitating recovery, right? And when I look at what they wrote in here, I took a close look at it, like regular backups, frequent system audits, clear recovery plans to mitigate damage. It's also related to, incident response, right? So when they put recovery out there, and again, those of you who are really, fans of the cybersecurity framework know that like response and recover are kind of considered two different functions. But in this aspect, it looks like what they're really trying to do is kind of lump together response and recovery and say, look, have a good, response and recovery plan. Do things that are normal for to make sure we can restore operations like backups. The ransomware attacks that were so prevalent, like 3 years ago, and they still kind of are today, but they got a lot of, press in like 2017, 2018, emphasize the importance of being able to restore a system from backup, right? If a system gets locked up and you get locked out of it, it's fantastic to be able to restore all that data, right? And also, focusing on continuing, operations. So that was probably the deepest, dive of the presentation. I just sort of wanted to dissect, those 5 things, and it looks simple, right? Like sometimes you snap your fingers and say, hey, cybersecurity recommendations for voter registration kind of falls into those, 5 things, but we've seen that there's a lot more to it. And again, so we've taken a look at just the voter registration systems, then we've looked at those 5 things, and all of a sudden, like anything in cybersecurity, now we've got a list of 22 things to do, right? And sometimes you might be left with, wow, this is overwhelming. The general election is like a couple of months away. What do we do next, right? And sometimes I get that impression when I read these things. So, it kind of takes me to focusing on what is really important here. And all of it obviously is important, like not just the voter registration systems, not just, some of the things I'm going to highlight here. We understand that's all important. Sometimes we spend too much time on something that we consider urgent, but how do we really figure out where to prioritize, right? And I think that's a central challenge, that we have. So before we get there, Charlene, why don't we open the last of the 3 poll questions? And because we described those 5 things for voter registration, I'm just curious to see, which of those 5 things, as we've seen a kind of a dissection of that, what do we feel that everybody thinks is kind of the most important?
Yeah, so the polling question is on your screen now. The question is, which of these is most vital for election integrity? Select from one of the following: secure external connections, easy for me to say, strengthen network defenses, enhance access management, improve system management and monitoring, or facilitate recovery and ensure continuity of operations.
Yep, and again, those were the 5 things that we summarized from the MITRE recommendations.
Yeah,
so I'm just kind of curious to hear like which of those jump out as like, whoa, this is where I would focus first.
Yeah, they're all obviously they're all important, but it will be interesting to see where folks fall in where what they think is the action, what they consider to be the most important thing. So
yeah.
I'm interested to see these poll results. And I am going to close it out now so that we can take a look at the poll results and keep the webinar moving. Here are the results. The majority of folks, it looks like, say secure external connections, which makes a whole lot of sense to me.
Yeah, and part of that reason why is that we all know that a lot of cyber attacks happen on a third-party type of system, and then they use that as a jumping off point, right, to get inside. So it's a really interesting point there. I think probably acknowledging that there is no right or wrong answer here, right?
Oh yeah, exactly.
Certainly there isn't, right? But the way I think about cybersecurity, and I think probably a lot of us on this call, cybersecurity is a game of risk management, and I will not bore you guys to tears with risk management type of discussion. But whenever there's something like this, that there's so many things to do, and the way we approach what we focus on our investments, we have to try to figure out like what can we do, like what are the top things that we can do to help bring risk from sort of an acceptable level down to, unacceptable down to an acceptable level. So when I took a look at these recommendations, I kind of thought, well, maybe what we ought to put out there are some of the areas that are sort of the highest areas of risk, countered with the things that we can actually do like right now. Things like network isolation and segmentation are incredibly important. But for those of you who have tried to take a project like that on, you know that it's incredibly hard to do, right? I mean, there's a lot of thought and time and effort, and there's a lot of people that need to be involved. And you'll see that while I agree that that's incredibly important to do, it wouldn't be the first place I would start, just given the fact that it takes a really long time to kind of analyze that. And then third, like what your budget and your time frame, kind of supports. In fact, with everyone working from home now, like what can we actually do? Like not just the budget perspective, but also like, what is what is it that's something that's possible for us to do, today? Because the world's changed, as you know, a lot, right? And then also what's aligned best, with some of these cybersecurity best practices. I'll definitely acknowledge that almost every one of these things can be aligned with a best practice, but I also use a lot of times the CIS controls, the top 20, to be able to, kind of align this stuff. So I took a look at this and I thought to myself, if I was to pick one area out of each of these 5, right, and I'm going to wrap up the presentation here in maybe about the next 5 minutes or so, what would they be? So the first one, when I think about secure external connections, and I think about understanding those patterns of communication before you do anything else, right? know what's legitimate, know what's illegitimate traffic. Like take a baseline of network activity, know which systems should be communicating with each other, right? Being able to analyze that network traffic and be able to spot potential threats, right? You saw from the, remember that redacted report that we showed, and it highlighted the fact that large volumes of information left a state, voter registration database. How would they have known that? They would have known that because they focused on patterns of communications. They'd have known that normally we only see this much data, but look at this, we've seen a spike of information leaving the voter registration database. Without even knowing the contents of it, that spike alone gives you an indicator of potential compromise. So that's why if I looked at just like securing external connections, the very first thing that I would do is focus on that patterns of communication aspect. And it kind of aligns with CIS control 12, which also makes this sort of the same kind of point. Now, the second one about strengthening internal and external defenses, the next thing I think about is those election officials using their workstations to access both the voter registration systems, and they're doing their email and their web and whatever else, right? So that is probably a great place to just look at that first, right? Those systems, those endpoints, right, that the election officials are using, or potentially anybody else that's interacting with the system that has a human being behind it, that might have email and web, right? Let's take a look at that and let's protect those systems from all those different types of threats that can arrive through email, phishing attacks, malicious web downloads and that kind of things. And that aligns with CIS Control 7, right? Email and web browser, protections. And maybe in a perfect world, they'd have dedicated systems that were sort of completely separate, but that's probably never going to happen. So focus there. Now, when we talk about enhancing access management, it has become incredibly easy, and it's almost become, I shouldn't say almost, it has become an enabler to enable multi-factor authentication. So for example, we do this here at Cisco, right? Yes, we have a password to get on, to our systems here at Cisco, but we also use multi-factor authentication. The password changes every, so often, it has to be complex and all that. But once I log in and I use my phone as the second factor, right, to authenticate, I'm on. And we also enable that through single sign-on to a lot of our cloud applications and things. So adding multi-factor authentication helps us, prove that people are who they say they are. We reduce the risk of, password-borne, types of breaches and things like that. And we can actually streamline the overall user experience. So that's, definitely an area to focus. And then when we talk about those election officials' workstations, let's protect those. Anything that has privileged, any of those endpoints that are used by people or systems and that have elevated privileges, let's make sure we protect that as like the last line of defense, right? It aligns with CIS Control 8, which is like, the malware defenses. Let's protect those things from potential, potential breaches. And then on the last point about like response and recovery, like start with a strategy. A lot of times it's so important to just have a solid incident response plan, something that's well thought out, something that everybody in the organization understands, something that's tested and done regularly. So that way, if something actually does happen, you're ready, right? So start with that recovery strategy. And there's a lot of different places that you can go for help on stuff like this. Like for example, NIST has a publication called, I think it's NIST Special Publication 800-184. And I think it's called Improving Recovery Operations, right? There's a lot of best practices out there, and there's certainly things that that we can do to help, which takes us to the things that we can start doing now, right? So I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you that like there's things that out there and there's technologies that you can use right now to help with each of these things. And one of them is like Cisco Stealth Watch, right? We have a cloud-based traffic analysis thing, solution that can plug in, right? Take a look at that traffic, baseline that activity, spot suspicious traffic patterns. It's part of our encrypted, traffic analytics solution too, to help spot malicious, like malware, for example, that hides in encrypted traffic, right? You don't have to decrypt the traffic to spot that stuff. You can just look for the patterns or the kind of the behavior associated with malware and the way it flows, and you can spot that stuff through like flow records, right? So StealthWatch Cloud is a incredibly powerful tool to really understand those patterns of communication that are happening on the network. And then secondly, we have solutions called Cisco Umbrella and our email security for the overall web, content filtering. It starts at the DNS level, right? If I'm an election official and I go www.maliciousdomain.com, right? That malicious domain, if we know that domain is malicious, wouldn't it be amazing if the DNS system could just say, hey, I'm not giving you the IP address, right? You're not going to connect to it at all. And that's exactly the primary area, right? Umbrella, has done for a really long time, is doing that DNS, level of security, but it's evolved, right? More into the, secure access service edge with things like, being better content filtering, firewall in the cloud, for example. So multiple security services delivered from the cloud is really, overall, what Umbrella brings to the table. And then Cisco email security, layers that email security on top of it, right? So even plugs into things like Office 365 to look for, for phishing attachments, right? For phishing links, or blocks that kind of stuff from ever reaching, the end user. And then when it comes to multi-factor authentication, one of our acquisitions from about 2 years ago was Duo Security, right? They provide that zero trust access. They have a really simple app, for example. Like I said, we use it here at Cisco to do multi-factor authentication. And it's super simple to register, right? People, you can do a self-register, you use your own phone to do the multi-factor authentication. It even checks the device, for example, to make sure it has the latest operating systems and stuff like that. So it's modern, it's simple, you can do it immediately, right? You protect any application from any device. And like when we say deploy easily in any environment, this is literally something that can be deployed immediately, right? In fact, all of this stuff is stuff that can be done very, very quickly. But things like Umbrella and Duo Security are so incredibly powerful because your remote workforce absolutely can do this now, right? Now, advanced malware protection, or what we're calling more of like our endpoint security, yeah, it has to do with, putting some, stuff on the actual endpoints, right? But we have to have something on the endpoints to be able to hook in deep to the application to look for behavior, exploit prevention, and stuff like that. But advanced malware protection is, basically the endpoint security that we bring to the table that helps protect those devices and protects those devices from becoming, obviously from being affected themselves, but also from becoming launch points onto other, types of things. So when we talked about those privileged endpoints, we absolutely should have advanced malware protection, on those privileged endpoints to be able to provide that secure and trusted access. And then finally, from that recovery strategy perspective, our Cisco Talos organization, this is a team of researchers who are absolute experts, not only in cybersecurity and threat research, but also as far as like going out and helping organizations recover from actual cyber attacks, right? So they can actually help organizations, sit down and figure out what that response plan ought to look like. Let's do a readiness assessment. Let's put those plans and playbooks in place. Let's make sure everybody is educated. And then if something does happen, like you can get right on the horn, right, with somebody to help, solve the immediate problem. Like press the, the alarm bell, right, and get somebody to, to help you, right? When we say somebody, we mean a cybersecurity response expert, right? This is expertise here that, that we have from our threat research organization that state and local governments, anybody, right, can benefit from. So from both a proactive and reactive, IR perspective. And we covered, just a couple of things to start now, but, some of the assets that you'll see, like especially from like the downloads in the webinar, there's a heck of a lot more that our portfolio, offers, right? So as we take a look at these different things, there's a lot more that we can do. So I encourage you to take a look at it, right? And taking a holistic approach, right? Where we have a platform-based, approach to cybersecurity. A lot of the stuff was sort of piecemeal, one thing at a time. What we're talking about is taking a platform or kind of integrated cybersecurity approach, right? So don't forget, like we haven't lost sight of the need to take an overall architectural approach, to cybersecurity. So as I wrap up here, I know I'm getting a little close here. I wanted to leave a little more time for questions. I wanted to point out that Matt is speaking at Black Hat, Matt Olney, our Director of Threat Intelligence and Interdiction. Wednesday, August 5th, he's got a session that's called What to Expect When You're Electing. So he'll cover a lot of that threat research that we've done over the past 4 years. And also CISA has a session, I think it's Christopher Krebs from CISA, so the same day. So if those of you who are attending the virtual, Black Hat this year, check out, the Matt session on, election security. And then we'll have these, these links here available, obviously, in the PowerPoint presentation of where to find, MITRE's voter registration paper. It's part of their election integrity page, some of the CISA resources that we described. And then, of course, like the information that we talked about here, right? Cybersecurity solutions for government, and even things like, aligning with other types of frameworks like MITRE ATT&CK and this cybersecurity framework and so forth. So, all right, Charlene, I didn't leave a ton of time for questions. Went a little bit longer,
Okay.
but let's see if we could take 2 or 3.
Yeah, I think we can probably squeeze 1 or 2, maybe 3 in. Let's see. What offerings and or technology does Cisco have or is working on to protect vote by mail voting? Is there
Yeah, vote by
anything?
mail.
Yeah.
Yeah, so obviously the first thing you think about is you do vote by mail, right? Obviously it'll probably go through some kind of like, optical scanner, right?
Hmm.
And that optical scanner will probably be on a network. So one of the things you'll see that in our portfolio, and it wasn't one of the ones that I highlighted, but it's a product that we call Cisco Identity Services Engine, and that has a lot to do with identifying devices that are actually on, the network, right? So let's make sure that this is a legitimate device, right? That's we don't want illegitimate optical scanners, for example,
Right.
feeding things in. But Cisco Identity Services Engine also drives a lot of that network policy-based segmentation, right? So that optical scanner should only be able to communicate, for example, with the system that's going to receive it, which is probably some kind of, intermediary before it gets to the next phase further down. So I think that's the first thing I think about is making sure that that's indeed is a trusted, legitimate endpoint, which is Cisco Identity Services Engine doing, and then also driving that segmentation to make sure that that traffic pattern is, or that traffic is only between those two devices.
All right, great. Let's do one very quick one and then we'll close it out. What is the relationship between the election security recommendations and MITRE attack?
I'm really glad that you brought that up because I actually put this just in the back because it was a natural thing that I was thinking about, right? And this is part of
Wow.
the slide where, because I focused a lot of our recommendations in aligning the top 5 things that I pointed out with the CIS controls, and it just, a lot of people are familiar with the CIS controls, but MITRE has also put together like the attack matrices, right? And it takes a different type of approach from like a best practice. It's like how attackers think, right? It stands for the adversarial tactics, techniques, and common knowledge. And that's a whole separate MITRE publication, and they didn't really tie them specifically together. But what I did was, just took a look at what they call mitigations, right? Mitigations are what to do about the different, attack techniques, right? So like when you see M1037, for example, that's MITRE's terminology that you'll find. So I did sort of a loose, kind of connection, between them here. And a lot of things in cybersecurity you can actually take and look back and map back to specific best practices. But I did think it was probably worthwhile just to kind of tie those two, kind of concepts together. So, I sort of anticipated, a question like that from folks to bring that up.
All right, well, I'm glad you put that slide together. We're about 3 minutes to the top of the hour, so unfortunately that's all the time that we have for questions. But if we didn't get to your question, I apologize, but please know that Steve is going to be getting a copy of all of the questions that came in, and I'm sure he or somebody from Cisco will be more than happy to follow up with you to get your question answered. I also want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of it, or if you just want to watch it again, you'll have the opportunity to do so. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And the webinar is also going to be living on the Security Boulevard website. So you can always go look for it there. Just go to securityboulevard.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. Okay, at the top of the hour, I didn't mention that we were going to be doing a drawing for 6 $25 Amazon gift cards. So let's get that done before we close things out. Our winners today. First winner is Daniel G. Congratulations, Daniel. Second winner is Gerald W. Congratulations, Gerald. Next winner, third winner is JT. Congratulations, Jay. Fourth winner today is Lucas K. Congratulations, Lucas. Next winner, winner number 5 is Rex C. Congratulations, Rex. And our final winner today, winner number 6 is William P. Congratulations, William. We'll be reaching out to all of you via email to get you your Amazon gift card to you. So check your inbox. If it's not there, check your spam folder. Steve, thanks so much for a great presentation. So much interesting information in this. And I think I'm actually going to look at the slide deck again myself and go through the presentation again because there's just such fascinating stuff. So thanks so much for your presentation. Lots of good stuff.
I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you so much, Arlene, and I thank you guys for listening. So we'll talk again soon.
I also want to thank the audience for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody. Please stay safe.